cybersecurity and compliance by hosting your environment in Azure as opposed to doing it in-house. Throughout the session, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. I'll be monitoring that. And at the end of the session, we usually leave about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, so feel free to take advantage of that. Otherwise, if we cover anything that you want to learn more about in a one-on-one session later on, I'll put my email address in the chat window, so you can feel free to reach out to me directly. All right, with that, I think I can hand it over to the folks at Netrix if you guys want to get started.
Sounds good. Thank you, Lane.
Yep, no problem.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Clark. I'm with Netrix out of our Chicago office. I'm a sales engineer and a solution architect focusing on Microsoft Cloud products. So that includes everything from Microsoft Azure to Office 365 to EMS, and really just working with all size clients to adopt the cloud technologies, but also focusing on security and compliance at the same time. So again, this is the 4th session in our Azure 123 webinar series. So if you want to take a look at any of the previous sessions, the website link is on the current slide here, and we can get started here. So the focus of today is really learning how deploying workloads within Microsoft Azure or in the Microsoft Cloud can really increase your security posture. So as we'll see as part of this, traditionally or even kind of maybe a way of people of thinking of the cloud versus on-premises as a less secure solution. Hopefully, by the end of this, we'll see a lot of the different controls and mechanisms that will really, show the contrary. So our agenda today is really looking at cloud security overall, Microsoft's approach to data security, also diving deeper into the actual workloads that can help set some of these controls around Azure and Azure AD. So some of these being just-in-time elevation with PIM or privileged identity management. We'll talk about how the Azure Graph and the Intelligent Security Graph is used within all sorts of different workloads within Azure and Office 365 and EMS. One of those including Azure Identity Protection. And then we'll end up looking at Microsoft Cloud App Security and how that can control and discover applications within your environment. So, in talking about cloud security, it's not an oxymoron. So, really, traditionally looking at the cloud, a lot of those inherent beliefs of data being off premises is less secure. My data centers are possibly more secure. My team is possibly better at it. A lot of these, really statements aren't to blame, right, as far as what's happening in the current environment. So when we look at the cloud, it's kind of an interesting term, but really if it's just another kind of data center that we're looking at. So it's not much different than possibly your current environment in regards to some of the items you need to understand in order to effectively manage or secure the aspects of the cloud. So in thinking of that, it is another data center. We still need to maintain and secure the VMs and the infrastructure within. That definitely doesn't go away in any way, shape, or form. You have backups, you have disaster recovery, you have high availability. You're still doing Windows updates depending on the type of operating systems you're running within the cloud. So a lot of that is inherent, but essentially there's a lot of controls that we'll see that will help you understand the capabilities in order to really get more insight into what's happening in your applications. If they're in the cloud, there's the idea of scaling, where you can scale applications at a much faster rate as far as possibly what your individual teams are capable of. So we can dive a little bit deeper into that. But it's always kind of funny in talking about the cloud in general, and then just thinking about a lot of the same things we have to think about security and compliance are still the same, even though it's in Microsoft Azure or it's in even a colo or another data center. So a lot of the same thought processes are there. So the kind of part on who can blame them is really about the current breaches that are going on, throughout the world. So really, every company is a target at this point. Hackers are looking for high-value assets within organizations, be that enterprises, be that K through 12, be that higher learning education as well. So it's not a day goes by that we don't have a new breach story coming out. The kind of mindset here is that assume you've been breached at this point, where hacking has really changed. The traditional thought process of penetration testing or pen testing is still valid, but it's really a different world now, where hackers have adapted to those types of controls, and really new threats have evolved from that. So in looking at a lot of the breaches, typically a hacker has been in your environment for over 200 days without being detected. So within that time, reconnaissance can be happening, escalation of privileges could be happening in the background. Once a simple single domain user's device is compromised, hackers can move along laterally to another high-level target, or possibly just do reconnaissance again while not being detected. So it's all about the monetization of really hacking and gathering information on their side, seeing if it's worth it as far as reconnaissance goes, and then if it is, it's escalating to those high-level targets within your environment. Again, with traditional controls, we have to look at this in a different way. So in talking about kind of pen testing that I mentioned, traditionally, you build the largest wall, the deepest moat around your environment, and that should keep intruders away. But now phishing attacks kind of go against that model, right? So if I open an email with a malicious link, now my PC is compromised. Had nothing to do with her firewall. It got by those essentially controls that were already there. So it's really adapting to this type of new threats, but also understanding how that would work in a Microsoft Azure or even a hybrid cloud environment, but also within your on-premises environment at the same time. So a good example of this that's pretty relevant that just came out is the city of Atlanta. So had a ransomware attack, and just saw an article yesterday that there were over $2.7 million spent in order to recover from this type of attack. And it's not really because that's the cost of the security controls that you would need around to prevent this type of attack. It's more of having that emergency response in this type of situation. So in order to try and remediate this attack, they've already spent $2.7 million, and there's still even applications that haven't been recovered. So it really becomes risk versus cost, but in the end, cybersecurity is essentially becoming the #1 priority. This is Microsoft's #1 priority. As we'll see, it's also ingrained throughout all the Azure applications, the Azure infrastructure, Azure AD, some of the other cloud products that I've talked about, Office 365 and EMS. So we really need to adapt to this becoming a primary focus. And you have regulations like GDPR coming fast and furious middle of May. So if you look at any residential information in the EU that you possibly might contain as far as students go, possibly locations that are in the EU as well, something to think about, where there's actual enforceable regulations now. There's data protection officers that need to be possibly a resource within your environment as well. But Microsoft is really focused on this and making it a #1 priority, and looking at some of the kind of controls and mechanisms that are in Azure and Azure AD. We have kind compliance manager in Office 365. So trying to look at all the various controls, gather them to understand how you can increase your security posture and your compliance posture in order to meet the GDPR regulations. There's the Security and Compliance Center itself. There's Azure Security Center as well. So looking at virtual machines, security controls, are they protected? Are they do they have sufficient malware protection? Is BitLocker being enforced? Are there other encryption mechanisms on your storage within Azure? Do you have the correct access control lists on your Azure VMs? There's also a great feature of just-in-time access for VMs in general. So having ports closed when you don't need them, but as say a consultant, when I need to access a set of VMs or a resource group remotely, I have access to them in a just-in-time fashion. We'll actually see how that works with identities later on in a demo with privileged identity management. So again, cybersecurity becoming #1 priority, but also the thought process of really how to adapt to these new types of threats. So that really leads to what's considered Microsoft's approach. And looking at Microsoft's approach, some of the advantages they have are the expertise, the resources, and the time. So essentially, this also reverses to your environment as well, is comparing it to the expertise with your environment, the amount of resources you have, and really just a function of time, right? Focusing on security versus other avenues or other high-value types of projects versus other security controls. So if we talk about expertise at Microsoft, and really even just in regards to security, which is our focus, Microsoft employs over 2,400 security professionals. They have a cyber defense operations center. There's digital crimes unit, so working with other governments, other three-letter acronyms, other security vendors. So working within the security environment, with the top experts and understanding and gathering that data along with their own security professionals. They also have security response centers, so if there is a breach as a Microsoft customer, that's also a service that's available to understand, what are the next steps, what guidance can you get, from Microsoft and these experts that have seen these breaches, on a daily basis. So in looking at that expertise, a lot of it is data as well. So we'll see that what's called the intelligent security graph gathers all this data from various endpoints, various consumer and corporate services like Office 365, Azure AD, Azure itself, consumer services like Outlook.com and Xbox, if you will. So all these are really data points, and in gathering data, there's over tens of petabytes of logs that are available to Microsoft and gathered on a daily basis. So you're really looking at all that expertise and all those capabilities then being introduced into Azure security controls, Office 365 security controls, and EMS security controls, and any other workloads that are within the Microsoft cloud at the same time. So an example of time too, understanding along with resources, do you have the time to say spin up a multi-tiered web application? And a good example of this that takes the advantage of moving to the cloud is if you look at something like that application, an example of maybe students enrolling. So if you have more of a large scale out of this application that's needed in order during enrollment period, and then it kind of scales back down. The cloud really gives you the capability to have that scale when you need it. So instead of having those resources always on premises, having that infrastructure, storage, networking, everything that goes with it, you can scale up for, say, a period of a week or so, and Azure can automatically take like a 3-tiered web application and scale out to meet demand of 20,000 plus applicants applying for classes or whatever really the scenario is, if you think about it. And then when that demand goes down, it can scale back down. So you have scale sets, and if you compare that to the time that it would take to implement that, along with the resources and even the expertise to design something that highly available or that can scale that far, you start to see the advantage of the cloud. So in looking at the intelligence security graph, a lot of data points that I was mentioning before, there's over 200 plus cloud consumer and commercial services that I mentioned. We talked about Office 365, Azure itself, Outlook.com. There's also 1 billion Windows devices, updated and reporting back. So a lot of these endpoints become this information aspect, and Windows 10 is really leading the charge with this. We'll see that not only with Windows 10 and Server 2012 R2 in 2016, you can have things like Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, and it's actually reporting back to this security graph. So all the information that it is gathering from these endpoints becomes really crucial and really that high value point for the Microsoft security stories. So gathering all this information, understanding what types of threats are out there, what's really happening within the environment, how hackers are adapting, seeing this in real time, getting that real time reporting is really what the intelligent security graph is all about. So along with the devices themselves, you have the authentication. So we'll start to see that there's behavioral learning that needs to happen and really becomes another high value point for the Microsoft story. So understanding that all this data is coming in, we're starting to see, compromised credentials as an example, or different types of authentication that would raise a risk level, and then want to be able to react to that. So logging Azure from a possible country that you would want to block as far as a policy would go. That's definitely capable now. So identity really becomes this new firewall. It's all wrapped around this intelligent security graph in order to kind of proactively react to these situations, and also use that machine learning to start to understand the types of threats that are constantly evolving out there. So again, consumer emails or exchange online, thinking about corporate emails and the various systems, over 200 billion emails analyzed. And then also Bing search service, 18 plus billion Bing web pages are scanned. So with all that said, with security being the focus, Microsoft spends over $1 billion a year on research and development focused on security. Again, we saw some of the stats and the capabilities of having a large amount of security professionals working with vendors, other organizations in order to understand the current threats throughout the world. And then at the same time, really bringing all these capabilities into the rest of their product line with all the Microsoft Cloud products. So what this really kind of envelops is having an enhanced security posture with these capabilities. So being able to protect, again, looking at endpoints or even data center aspects within Azure, also being able to detect. So we talked about Azure Security Center, Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection, having these capabilities to detect these types of signals using the intelligent security graph and also machine learning to then really respond. So having the capabilities around this, being able to scale to these types of services without having infrastructure involved. So an example of that would be lighting up Azure Security Center. So it's really just going into the portal and enabling the service and understanding what types of aspects you're monitoring. And the scale of that and the way it monitors is all handled within the cloud. So traditional type of SIM systems compared to that, very complex, very high infrastructure requirements. So kind of a good way to look at the difference there as well. So, and kind of looking at Microsoft's approach as well and how we relate it to some specific technologies that we're going to see here are looking at identity protection. So I mentioned there's what's called Azure AD identity protection. We'll see how that will look at various risk scenarios, one of them being browsing from an anonymous source and react to that maybe with various conditional access policies. There's also the concept of Azure AD privileged identity management, which we'll see here in a second, that will allow you to escalate traditional user IDs that are non-privileged up to a privileged identity role for really just-in-time access. So very powerful in thinking about identity being the new firewall, being that access point, and being so ingrained into all these cloud products that we're talking about. Outlook itself for the mobile side of things has been brought into Azure, so fully powered by Microsoft Cloud and also the rest of the controls that we've been mentioning. We have Windows Defender Advanced Threat Protection for Windows 10, Server 2016, and even 2012 R2. Also Windows Defender Application Guard. Talking about conditional access overall is kind of wrapped into a lot of these technologies as well that we'll explore. And then understanding really an expanded partner ecosystem. As Netrix being a Microsoft partner, we can come up with custom solutions that give even more insight into some of these applications as well. So custom BI, Power BI dashboards is an example, really tapping into that intelligent security graph or the Microsoft graph on the back end and be able to pull information that's relevant to whoever needs it. So the first technology we're going to look at is called Privileged Identity Management, or PIM. And what PIM allows you to do is really escalate those standard user IDs. So in my example, we have Office 365, we have Azure AD, we have Azure tied to Azure AD, and it's really my single identity that gets me into our systems at Netrix. So in looking at that, I'm a normal user on a regular basis, so I really don't need administrative privileges unless I need to, take a look at some settings, test out some policies, or do some administrative tasks. So PIM allows you to escalate from a normal user to, say, a global administrator, or even a security administrator, or other aspects within the different role-based access controls. Now that just went GA will allow you to escalate into different roles within Azure itself. So on a normal basis, I might be a reader of a certain resource group within Azure that contains virtual machines, security objects, everything that goes along with resource groups. But then I can also escalate to a contributor role. So if I have to make some changes on a couple of various VMs that are running in Azure, I can escalate, make those changes. It's all audited, which is one very powerful feature. So there's a reporting aspect to this that can also be surfaced through various reports. And then depending on the policy settings, I could escalate back down automatically, and after an hour, I lose those privileges. So we'll see that you can set the time frame, you can set other various aspects with privileged identity management. But a very powerful feature, looking at global admin, if you're familiar with Office 365 or even Azure, are tied to global admins as well. But if you think about service administrators, co-administrators, same type of concepts, right? They're the highest level that have the most privileges. So if those accounts are compromised, that becomes a very big problem, and you have really the keys to the kingdom in the Microsoft Cloud world. So you really want to protect those items, and this is a great way to do that. So we want to over a little bit of what PIM is designed to do, but some of the controls that you have around that are things like multi-factor authentication. So being able to enforce MFA in order to escalate to, say, a global administrator, as an example. So with global administrators, it actually defaults to MFA. So it's kind of a setting that you can't even toggle. So it's really enforcing the fact that that's the highest privilege that you want to protect, and we're going to enforce MFA. With some of the other roles within Azure, you can set if you want MFA as far as one of the protection mechanisms, or you can even have a reason that we'll see, or maybe even another workflow for approval. So you have a lot of different flexibility as far as how you want to control the identities. But again, it's limiting the privileged accounts and bring them into this model. So I'm going to stop presenting here real quick, and we'll switch over to the PIM demo. So privileged identity management with a lot of the other cloud services that we're mentioning are really located within the Azure portal now. So if you go to portal.azure.com, if I look on the left, we have a lot of the traditional Azure services, virtual machines, storage, virtual networks. But underneath, we have a lot of kind of EMS controls as well. So one of those being Azure AD identity, um, sorry, Azure AD Privileged Identity Management, or what we'll call PIM. Um, so within PIM, I have various roles, and I've already actually escalated as a global administrator in order to even show some of the admin settings here, but we can go through the process and see how you would escalate for a different type of role. So I have access to 4 different roles here within our environment: Intune Service Administrator, Global Administrator, Information Protection Administrator, and then Conditional Access Administrator. So we can see that my access is valid until 12:51 today. So we have our access settings set at 1 hour, and then the access is revoked. So again, I'm a normal user, C. Clark at nitrixllc.com. I don't have access to anything as a normal user except the normal workloads and services within, but I've escalated already. So if I look at Conditional Access Administrator, in order to activate this, you can see that the duration is set on the back end as far as the admin settings go, but also I can provide a reason. So simple as that. It's more of an audit control. Do you want them to provide a reason? Do you need another workflow aspect that might go to an approval for a higher level or a manager? That person would get an email workflow, be able to go in here and approve the request, and that user is off and running. So depending on the privilege, you might want to institute those type of protection mechanisms, or you can allow the user to escalate whenever they want, which is essentially my activity here, and then based on that, we'll be able to jump right into the admin features that I need access to. So within privileged identity management, there's also the concept of Azure resources. So I mentioned this actually just went GA, or general availability, and being able to really look at Azure itself instead of more on the identity piece. So the identity that's tied to the components in Azure, but by default, I have read access to a resource group in Tom Lilly's subscription here. So I could also escalate to a contributor role instead of just a reader role, and be off and running within Azure, and within a few minutes the VMs would show up in my virtual machine area, and be able to escalate, and then same type of concept, it will remove my privileges after a certain set period of time. So very powerful feature. Some of the let me refresh this, sorry. So in looking at the settings and the various roles, I mentioned that we have global administrator, which again is that top level role. So if we look at the settings for this, you can see some of the customizations that are available. Being able to set that activation duration, we have it set to 1. It could be higher, and that would be a global setting. We can see that MFA is disabled because this by default requires MFA. Um, One thing to note, when I was logged in, my device itself counts for MFA, so you have an idea of devices being trusted that the users are using. So because I signed in with Windows Hello, which is facial recognition and counts as a secondary factor for MFA, it allowed me to go into the portal without, or allowed me to escalate without providing those credentials. But if I didn't have a trusted device, I would have got a prompt on my phone and I would have said in the Authenticator app to approve that, and then I'm off and running as a user. So very easy user experience as far as ease of use goes on the user side of things. But you can see we have notifications, we have ticket requests as a possibility, or even require approval. So a lot of great capabilities, but a key feature in thinking about this new security posture that we're trying to understand and go for is to protect identities, right? So my identity gets me into really everything within the cloud here. I need these controls around it, especially for administrative roles or privilege roles, to then gain control again, but also report on these types of escalations. So I'm going to stop presenting here real quick and switch back to our slides. So the next technology we want to talk about is taking advantage of that intelligent security graph, and that's Azure AD Identity Protection. Um, Again, we saw this in the Azure portal itself. It's one of the Azure services that will surface in the portal that we'll see here in a second. But really understanding some of the capabilities that Azure AD Identity Protection has and how it stems from the information that is surfaced from the intelligent security graph. So what this allows you to do is really a higher level of conditional access to take a look at various scenarios that impose risk in your environment. So examples of this are impossible travel, access from anonymous IP addresses, access from unfamiliar locations, um, and setting policies around these risk levels. So is anonymous IP like a Tor browser that we'll see, is that considered a high risk? And do you want to enforce MFA? Do you want to actually block access completely? Or even blocking a location itself. So really a lot of security controls around being able to react to these types of scenarios, automatically. So it's very seamless to the user. If it is a valid user that's accessing from, say, a Tor browser for some reason, they'll get prompted for MFA in our example that we'll see here in a second, and they'll have to authenticate with that second factor. So really proving that the user is who they are is one key piece to identity protection, that we're seeing here in this new kind of security posture that we're going for. So you can target it to specific users or all users. You can create policies that are targeted to, just a group of users, and then the other policy that might be more restrictive for another group of users. So completely customizable and gives you the ability to really take control here. So I'm going to jump right into the demo here and switch over again here. So Azure Active Directory Identity Protection is also located in portal.azure.com. So we can see it's right below Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. Again, these are all the Azure services that we're seeing. So when I escalated as a global administrator, I now have access to more of the administrative features in here instead of having, again, just a read-only view. So my account is still escalated from PIM, and now we can take a look at Azure AD Identity Protection. So overall, you have a dashboard of different vulnerabilities or risk levels that are being reported on. So more of an overview, but what we can see is that how some of these policies are created or configured. So if we take a look at risk events within our environment, here's some examples that I was mentioning. Do we have sign-ins from anonymous IP addresses? Impossible travel. So what that means is if I logged in from a U.S. location, then a few minutes later from China, say as an example, that's typically impossible unless maybe there's a fringe example of IT using VPNs. So it really helps you get again that behavioral learning, that intelligent security graph, right? Surfacing this information to then actually create a scenario upon it and then react upon that scenario. Um, so based on these, we have MFA registration, which really reports back on our users using MFA. So you can run more of a query as far as if you wanted to institute MFA for all users, are the users registered? Are they currently using MFA? Or report back on that so you can really operationalize multi-factor all together with your environment. But then we really take a look at our risk policies. So in looking at a risk policy, we have those controls. So we talked about some of the scenarios, and those are essentially inherent in the service itself. So there's really more of like a matrix. I'll show here are the risk policies, here's how they're defined, and here's what area they're under. But again, those are like anonymous IPs, impossible travel that we mentioned before. But you have the various controls here. So we could either flat out block access, or we could allow access and say maybe require multi-factor authentication, or even require MFA registration if they're not registered, require a password change. So you have a lot of flexibility, and again, this is completely reactive, right? It's not you looking at a log and then instituting something. It's on the fly. So we'll see with the demo of this that if I browse from a Tor browser, it will trigger one of these policies. So sign-in risk policy, again, whatever categories fall under sign-in risk policy will have the same type of controls. And then we have various alert. You can have a weekly digest to a distribution group or a set of users that would be, in compliance or security that are looking at these types of risks that are being reported on, and then choose to, tighten controls or understand, more of what's really going on in your environment. So if I were to look at what's called a Tor browser, this is a browser that is freely available on the internet. You can download it, install it very easily, and it just acts like another browser, with Internet Explorer, or Chrome, or Edge, same thing. So just another browser, very easy to download, anyone has access to, and what it's used to do is really anonymize your connections. So there's thousands of relays throughout the world that this is traveling through that essentially your source IP really wouldn't be able to be found as far as detection mechanisms go. So if I sign in to portal.azure.com with my Netrix account, so far it just looks like the normal portal. It will switch to our branding, just like you see in Office 365 or even in Azure itself, as you can see. But when I sign in this time, sorry. When I sign in this time, it's going to recognize that I'm coming from an anonymous browser because of our Azure AD identity protection mechanism here. So we can see that suspicious activity is detected. something unusual is happening with your sign-in. It could have been a new location. So again, that behavioral learning where it's tracking your location. If all of a sudden for the last year you've signed in from the US, but you sign in from a certain country that might be under a policy, then it can detect that. And we'll even see Microsoft Cloud App Security can either enhance more policy controls around this as well and work hand in hand with this. But what it's doing is asking me to verify. So on my phone, I have what's called the Authenticator app, and this is essentially the easiest way to use MFA within the Microsoft Cloud. So if I say approve request to Microsoft Authenticator app, I've now been challenged for that MFA, right? So if this was an attacker trying to log in to Office 365 or Azure from an anonymous browser, would have been stopped in its tracks unless, somehow kidnapped that user along with being a hacker. So highly improbable in that way, but as you can see, very powerful. So this has to bake a while. It's always delayed as far as how the communications go, but just wanted to show that I received the request and I approved it, and then I'd be signed into Azure. So really that was my user risk control or sign-in risk policy, enforcing that with the MFA controls. So very, very powerful. You can run this in your environment in more of an audit mode to understand what's happening, and then really choose to really look at how you can institute some policies to start to gain control. So I'm going to switch over to our last topic here, which is Microsoft Cloud App Security. Okay, sorry for the delay there. So the next topic is talking about monitoring SaaS applications with Cloud App Security. So Microsoft Cloud App Security is an EMS component. There's also an Office 365 version that's directly related to controlling Office 365 workloads versus maybe other workloads that we can bring in that are shown here, like Box or Dropbox, Salesforce, etc. So really, whatever the conversation revolves around shadow IT, and it's the idea that users are really going to use the applications that they want to use to get their job done. Um, this is happening, really in every environment. And how do you gain control around this? How do you gain insight overall into it? What can you actually do about it as far as controls go, or maybe reining in these types of applications? So shadow IT could really represent any cloud application that's being used. We're showing some examples here of Box, Dropbox, Google Apps. These might not be sanctioned apps from IT, but they're still being used regardless in your environment. Um, so the vulnerability there is really, what's happening with your corporate data. Is it possible that a user could take files off of file share and simply just upload them to Dropbox without you knowing? Even goes into the same for Office 365. Without controls, I can do the same thing as well. So the cloud does introduce, these vulnerabilities, but that's always been the same. So users, want to work on any device, anytime, anywhere. That's kind of the new reality here in IT, and these types of controls are really what we finally have to kind of one, get insight, and then also take control. So it's not really anything new with the cloud per se. It's just understanding that the boundaries have been expanded, and that's expected traditionally by your users now. So what we want to look for is really suspicious activities, overall kind of traffic. So Cloud App Security allows you to do is look at various data sources directly. So these could be firewalls, um, proxies, any type of SIM systems as well to ingest logs. And then at the same time, we have direct APIs to various applications. So in looking at the API integration, we have services like Box, ServiceNow, AWS, Office 365, of course. So there's a set of applications that have the direct API integration, which can actually have the most powerful controls around applications in your environment. But the other aspects of the data sources with the log collectors looking into all apps that are being used within your environment as well. So being able to detect over 13,000 applications, understanding various aspects of what applications are being used. It could rate applications as well as far as a service level goes. And we'll see the dashboard here in a second. So very, very powerful tool. But again, part of that is really just having insight into that shadow IT, but now actually taking control of it. So I'm going to switch over to Cloud App Security here. So with Cloud App Security, it is a separate portal but can be accessed through either an Office 365 link or going directly to portal.cloudappsecurity.com. So we really start out with more of a dashboard, understanding what current types of alerts are triggering, what's being monitored, get a very good overview of what's happening in your environment. The idea behind Cloud App Security, again, is being able to discover, then investigate, and then even create policies to control the various cloud apps within your environment. So if we look at Discover, say we want to take a look at discovered apps, we can start to see all the different applications that are found in our environment. Maybe what are the top 10 applications that are being used in the environment. If some of these are a surprise, then you start to say, all right, well, how are users using these one, or why are users using these as well? So if it's something where you have Office 365 and they're using another cloud storage provider, why is that case when you already have that capability? It really gives insight into aspects like that, but also you have what's called a risk score. So you can score each application depending on various factors. And those factors can be completely customized. So let's say you are looking at various aspects of meeting GDPR requirements. You can take a look at the toggles that are related to that and give them a higher score, so they have more of an impact in your scoring mechanism. We can see scores from 1 through 10, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst, and how each app is scored here. So not only one insight into what apps are being discovered, but also understanding how the apps are scored in general. So when we look at how they're scored, again, it's completely customizable for various aspects, but some of the default areas are looking at various compliance or certifications, the types of security controls that are involved. Do they support SAML, so you could possibly bring them into Azure itself? So part of the strategy here would be if you find an unsanctioned application that a lot of users are using, why not bring it into more of a single sign-on where the users will have all the same controls that we've been talking about around that application at the same time, but then they're using the application that they want to use. So it's a very kind of circular type of model, understanding, discovering, and really seeing why this type of shadow IT is going on in your environment. So you can really surface some definitely very, very interesting things throughout your environment. So the more, as time goes on, you start to see various behavioral learning aspects. So you can start to think about those login scenarios we talked about. So if a user's logging in from that impossible travel scenario that's also surfaced here, risky IP addresses. There's various threat protection mechanisms as well to detect based on various policies. So there's a fair amount of built-in templates, but you can completely take either an existing template and customize it with the different conditions or create one from scratch. So a lot of capabilities here, but one key piece having insight into the environment itself, but then also taking control. So if we look at the type of connected apps here, one thing I want to point out is this is our current environments. We have Office 365. We're heavily using Office 365 for really everything, Exchange Online, as you can see here, as far as logins go, but also all the rest of the services. We use ServiceNow, Amazon Web Services. So a lot of different connected apps, even above and beyond Office 365, and then the rest of the apps are surfaced through the discovery mechanism. So that really concludes everything as far as the presentation goes. So did we have any questions come up in the chat window?
I didn't see any questions in the chat window, but if you guys do have questions, feel free to type them in there now, or if you have the ability, you can take yourselves off mute. I'm not sure if you guys gave them access to do that or not, but
let me verify if that.
Yeah. Sometimes we don't give the audience access to take themselves off mute. Yeah, Christina just pinged me, so they aren't able to take themselves off mute. So if you guys do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. If you have any questions that you don't think we can cover in the next little bit of time we have left, you can always feel free to follow up with us. You have my email. You can also follow up with the folks at Netrix for a one-on-one session.
Okay, I don't think I'm seeing any questions in the chat window.
Okay, well, if you guys are interested in taking action on any of what you learned, you can make a minimum investment. It's just $100 a month for an Azure subscription. To do that, you can reach out to your preferred reseller and they can get you a quote. If you missed our first webinar, we actually go over pretty in depth what you can get for $100 a month investment into Azure. And then keep a lookout for a follow-up email or where we'll send out recordings of today's session and past sessions. With that, I guess I'll thank you guys for your time again, and I'll let you guys get on with your days. Hope to be hearing from you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys. Bye.